Today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the concept of dialect. What is it? Dialect is a form of a language. It includes speech habits and patterns. And there are different reasons for dialect. There can be social class, region, and group dialects. So those are all the different types of dialect. Dialects are unique in many ways. They include their own unique grammar, their own unique punctuation in terms of writing, and often their own unique vocabulary as well. There are standard and non-standard dialects. Standard dialect we could consider a correct form. These forms would be supported by institutions. So if you were using a standard dialect, it would be okay to write an essay in that dialect. It would be acceptable for a college, university, an English class. And then there are non-standard dialects. Those are not supported by institutions. They would be what we would consider to be not formal writing, not formal communication. There are many English dialects in the United States, and it's important to realize at this point that even though we speak English, we all speak different varieties of English, and those varieties are dialects. And those varieties, those dialects, can be broken into categories. There is a cultural category, so like Pennsylvania Dutch, Chicano. Those dialects are based on your culture, your background, your heritage. There are also regional dialects, such as Boston, New York City, St. Louis, Texas, Hawaiian. If you go to New York City and you listen to people speak, yes, they're speaking English, but you can often hear that New York dialect, that way of speaking. And the same thing for Boston. You hear that different sound. Think about when you go down to the South, the Southern dialect, where people are saying y'all, and there's that drawl. That's part of their dialect. It's still English. It just has its own kind of grammar, its own sound to it, and oftentimes its own vocabulary. There are way too many dialects that we could ever mention in the United States today. Some very, very small regions, and also some larger dialects, like the Southern dialect. So we're not going to try to talk about them all, but I want to give you a little bit of an example of what this actually looks like in practice. So, for instance, what would you call the generic term for a carbonated beverage that's pictured below? Well, if you're like me, you probably call it soda. If you take a look at this map, this is actually based on a survey that was done. It was a dialect survey. You can see choice A, which was the top choice with 53%, chose soda. And you can see this red area, and anywhere that there's red, people in those areas refer to it as soda. But there are other colors on the map. We have this large section up here of blue. They call it pop. And actually, if you go to Western Pennsylvania, like Pittsburgh, you don't ask for a soda, you ask for a pop. You can also see that there are some other smaller dialect choices in here. Some places call it a fizzy drink, for instance, a Coca-Cola, a soft drink. There's a few places down here in the South that refer to it as a soft drink. So this gives you an idea of different regions that use different dialects. And this is all part of it. This is vocabulary, word choice. Let's look at another one. What would you call that? Okay, well, different choices. Crawfish, crayfish. I personally would call it a crayfish. But you can see from this map, different areas call it different things. We have the area where we're at, blue, where we do see crayfish more. Although there's some smatterings of crawfish. As you come down farther, down in the southern area, you have a lot of crawfish, but you also have southern and heading towards the Midwest, a lot of crawdad. Same creature, just different terms for it. It's part of our dialect. Also, you can see some of these landlocked areas, they have no word for this critter. It may just be because they don't have any of these creatures anywhere close to them. So it's not a word that's in their normal vocabulary. Here's another one. What would you call this? Well, a good chunk of the United States is going to call it a sub. Hello, Subway. However, there are some localized areas. There's a section right here that would call it a hoagie. There's a section up here, up in New England, that would call it a grinder. Way up here, we have them calling it Italian sandwich. And down here along the Gulf Coast, they're actually called poor boys. So same thing, just a different term for it. It's part of our dialect. Okay, let's do one last one. We see a good chunk of it's going to call it a shopping cart. Down south, though, part of the southern dialect, we're going to be calling it a buggy. We have some scattered grocery carts in here. And actually way down here, below Florida, we're calling it a shopping wagon. So that is a very localized dialect word. It's important as we look at these, all of these examples have centered around what we call things, the vocabulary words. However, it's not always just the vocabulary. Sometimes it's just the pronunciation. For instance, my father, who's from Ohio, often says that he is going to wash the car, and he is going to go to Washington. He has icing on his cupcakes, and we used syrup on our pancakes. Now, to you, some of those things probably sound pretty funny. My guess is you don't use syrup, but you probably use syrup. You probably don't use icing. My guess is you use icing or frosting. And you probably don't wash your car. You probably wash it. Again, it's still English, obviously, but it's different pronunciations. It is part of the dialect. So why this is important? First of all, dialects are important because they reflect our heritage. They reflect our cultural background. Remember, like the Pennsylvania Dutch background, some Hispanic and Latin backgrounds. Also important because they reflect the region that we're from. And when you take pride in your region, you want to contain those dialects. Dialects also add variety to our language. Without dialects, our language would, at least in my opinion, sound very flat. But this adds some variety, some spice. So why do you need to care about these things? First of all, you need to be aware that dialects can cause misunderstandings. If you move to a different region or you enter into a different cultural area and you ask for one thing, they may look at you kind of funny. For instance, and this is a small instance, but it is an example of a misunderstanding. I went to an ice cream shop in Pittsburgh, and I desperately wanted sprinkles on my ice cream. There were no sprinkles on the menu. Like, what ice cream shop in the world does not have sprinkles? Well, it turns out ice cream shops in Pittsburgh don't have sprinkles. They have jimmies. It's their word for it. I misunderstood. I didn't know that sprinkles were referred to as jimmies there. Simple. Obviously, there are misunderstandings on a grander scale, but that would be just one example. People often have misconceptions about dialects as well. For instance, some people feel that those who speak with a southern dialect are slower than those who speak with a northern dialect. And by slower, I don't mean just slower speaking, but I mean slower mentally. Absolutely not the case. Southern people are just as intelligent as northern people. It's just their dialect is different. We're going to watch an example, actually, of a video after you watch this one, where the people are speaking from the Outer Banks, and the one gentleman says that he's often asked if he doesn't even live in the country, if he's American. So we get this misconception about people who speak differently than us, not recognizing that it's simply just a dialect of the same language that we speak. If you have any questions about what a dialect is, please feel free to give me a call or email me. The best way to think about a dialect, though, is really to see it as just a different variety of the main parent language. Thanks.